I am so excited to continue with our theme of living into the resurrection in this evening's plenary, leading to influence with hope in a post-resurrection world.
Thanks, Donna. In our devotion this morning, we heard in John chapter 20, verses 24 through 31, we witnessed Jesus appearing after his death and resurrection to the disciple Thomas and heard a direct report from Thomas. He invited us to see our own faith struggles with doubt and hope in a post-resurrection time, and he bravely stepped up as a leader and ignited a movement for justice against systems of oppression. In tonight's plenary, we continue working with the timeline tool presented in plenary number 1. If you need to see last night's questions or prompts or detailed instructions on how to create your timeline, you can visit the link to the document, Conduct Becoming of a Woman, which is found in the Resources tab of your registration portal. Here's an example of my timeline from yesterday. Can you see? Birth date, some other important events, ending with today's date. So I drew the horizontal line with my birth date at one end and yesterday's date at the other, and you can see where I marked key events in my life along the length of the horizontal line. Now, please remember, this is your tool. So if a timeline's linear design just does not speak to you, you're welcome to draw your timeline any way that is most helpful to you. And of course, you can use whatever colors or images that you would like and you feel represent these pivotal moments in your own lives. So now let's get started.
You will need to get out your timeline from yesterday and colored pencils and markers. It's important for you to select one color pencil or marker that is different from the one you used yesterday in step 1. As a reminder, the instructions for the timeline activity are in the chat.
Great. As a reminder, we will ask a series of questions which will be shown on the screen. You will write short notes or draw a symbol to represent each experience on your timeline, including dates wherever possible. Our first question is, at the time of your birth, what were the spiritual or religious beliefs of your primary caregivers? Make a symbol of this to put next to your birth date and shade or otherwise mark the time period for which this held. Also, mark on your timeline the date of your baptism. If you were confirmed into church membership, mark this date as well. If you were not baptized or confirmed, you don't need to mark anything. You have 3 minutes.
Welcome back. Next, if you've gone through important evolutions in your religious identity, mark these moments or periods on your timeline. This may include things like you converted from one faith to another, joined a faith community or united women in faith, changed faith communities, or no longer attended a faith community. Try to remember your first experience you had as the holy, of something sacred, of a mystery larger than yourself, or experiencing grace. Mark this on your timeline. Add any subsequent similar moments. Indicate this with dates and a symbol or a picture with each other. You have 3 minutes.
You're doing a great job. Now ask yourself if you have ever experienced any time when you lost hope or your belief in God was tested. If so, add this to your timeline. When did it happen? What happened? How was the faith crisis resolved? Think of how your understanding of God has evolved. Can you identify certain pivotal moments or characterize your beliefs in certain time periods? Try to mark this on your timeline. You have 3 minutes.
Last prompt. Mark the period of membership in different churches or congregations with dates and symbols or a short note. How has your church membership shaped your reading of the Bible or understanding of God, your understanding of the roles of women? You have 3 minutes.
this exercise has been insightful for you. Thank you, Christina and Donna, for walking us through this wonderful time together. What a blessing truly to be in this space together, sharing our stories, telling our truths. My name is Ilka Vega, and I am originally from the Tigua lands of El Paso and Ciudad Juarez borderlands. And I serve as Executive for Economic and Environmental Justice. And I'm here with my dear colleague, Marianne Comfort, Justice Coordinator for the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas. Hi,
So good to
Marianne.
join you, Ilka. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you for being here with us. I'm going to start by saying that we're here because we're courageous, all of us. We've been through thick and thin, and we continue to be loyal to God's promises and strive to do God's work of love, justice, grace, and mercy. But we also find ourselves, we are human after all, today, much like the disciples and women following Jesus after his death, filled with uncertainty, perhaps despair. In this day and age, feeling the weight of the humanitarian crisis, the war crisis, the climate crisis that we're facing today. And so we are trying to make sense of it all. Turning to God, turning to our communities. In the Methodist tradition, turning to the Wesleyan quadrilateral of scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. To reground ourselves and find purpose and direction. Or we turn to science that is telling us that we can't continue with ecological destruction. Something indigenous peoples have told us for hundreds, thousands of years. And yet we see corporate greed stepping over environmental protections, stepping over human rights, and even human lives. But as unique as these times are and how overwhelming they feel, perhaps there's lessons, experiences from our past, from our timelines, from each other, from scripture that we can learn from. So it's so important that we're doing this exercise of processing, of remembering together, of meaning making. So Marianne, I turn to you as a longtime advocate for climate and environmental justice. In your faith journey, in your work, where have you felt despair? Perhaps when has your faith been tested?
Yeah, thank you for the question. My mind goes back to 2017 and when we saw the Trump administration pull the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accords. And then we saw the renewing of the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline, which a lot of us were fighting against with the indigenous peoples in the Dakotas and Nebraska. And then we were seeing dismantling of climate policies and environmental policies. And it was a very discouraging time. And I remember carrying a lot of worry about the U.S. Stepping back from leadership, from engaging with the rest of the world on this important question and issue of climate change, and concern about the communities that were going to be harmed by more oil and gas extraction. And there was a lot of worry, and it went on for quite a while. And so, in this particular moment, feeling some of that same worry coming when we're hearing about, again, we might pull out of the Paris Climate Accords. There might be rollback in environmental protections. I'm starting to feel the same edginess, anxiety, and worry.
Yeah, I think a lot of us can relate, especially with so many things that are happening. Can we trust our leaders? Can we trust the people in power? What is it gonna happen? I think we definitely feel some of the uncertainty coming, and we strive to seek hope. And I'm curious where you found hope back then, and where do we find hope now? And even if hope might feel out of reach sometimes, perhaps feels too ambitious, depending where we are, what are some first steps that we could take to make meaning of it, or to get out of that state of despair?
Sure. So two things come to mind. One is turning to our religious traditions and our religious teachings and our faith leaders. Turned to Pope Francis and his teachings in Laudato Si, his environmental teaching in 2015, where he talks about we need to hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And that's so grounding to me. That keeps me centered. And that is our work as people of faith, of seeing those interconnections of environmental injustices and social injustices. And then he also talks about the need to get up, move away from fossil fuels without delay. And that keeps me focused on what the job is, what the task is. So it's going back to those teachings. The other thing that is just really fills me with hope is doing this work in coalition. I mean, it's not me going to Capitol Hill and trying to push for policies. It's not even others within the Sisters of Mercy. We work in coalition with a lot of faith groups in Washington, D.C. We all work together in a big coalitions. We can carry the faith voice to the halls of power. And we also work with secular groups. I mean, I got to tell you, yesterday I was in a meeting with all these environmental and conservation groups, and we were talking about how do we create momentum for reform of our U.S. laws on mining on public land. And this is a really important thing right now, because when we're talking about the transition to renewable energy, we're also hearing it requires a lot of minerals. So there's a lot of conversation around mining. And so all the environmental and conservation groups, they're talking about what this means, what the policies are. They could get really in the weeds and all that. And then they're like, but we need other messengers. A lot of, people in Congress aren't going to listen to the environmental groups. They're used to hearing from us. Who else can be messengers? And me and my other colleague from another faith group were saying, faith community, well, we can carry the message. And the tone in the room was people were excited. They're like, yes, if you could, get folks to contact their legislators, and if you could, get the message out about why this is important. And I left that meeting so much more hopeful and energized, because we are in it together. We all have strengths, we all have things that we bring to this work. And if we work together, we can have much more impact.
Definitely. And I think you phrased it really, really well. And it resonates a lot with, I'm currently here in Azerbaijan, participating and following COP29, the UN Climate Summit. And last week we had a meeting with the Department of State, and almost precisely the example that you're sharing, sharing a little bit about, the role of environmental organizations, but also the very special role of faith communities, and how we can bring that message and bring groups together that perhaps not always talk to each other, but somehow as people of faith, we can convene and create space, just like this space indeed. And I love that you talked about the traditions and wonderful histories that we have, rich histories. We have Laudato Si, and in the Methodist Church, we also have our social principles that talked about the natural world and how to face environmental racism. And so there are rich traditions definitely to ground ourselves with. And I love also well that you touched on community, because this is what we're trying to build here. This is what we are right now, right? Community, and how it enriches us. And you provided already some examples, but I'm curious to know if you can share a little bit more on, first of all, why in community, right? And not versus alone. Like, what is really the impact that we can do together? And some examples or strategies of things that have been, yeah, again, more successful to do in community. A lot of us perhaps may feel isolated in times like this, feel like we're the only ones. And so finding communities is so crucial. So where do we find it, and what are the type of things that we can do together?
Yeah, so one key thing is just emotional support. You know, you're with other people who are also feeling some despair at time, discouragement, and we kind of lift each other up. Practically speaking, I mean, I think there's a couple of things I'd really name. One of them is we all carry different knowledge and expertise and experience. So some of us were talking about we needed to create a document that talked about faith principles for sourcing of minerals for the energy transition. So we had a bunch of us, you know, we're working on the language, working on what's the best way to talk about this. And so we had a much stronger and richer document because we had a lot of people contributing to the writing of it than just one person doing that. The other thing is all the relationships we bring. So somebody might have good relationships with certain offices on Capitol Hill. Somebody else might have other relationships. Some people might have relationships with communities that are most impacted by climate change or environmental degradation, and they can bring them in to talk firsthand experience. So all those relationships help us be more effective because together we have a lot more um, people we can bring into it. And the third thing I'd say is that in community, we can be a visible witness. We can be in places and have a visible witness. So a few weeks ago, we had an interfaith prayer vigil outside of the Department of State to pray for the success of COP29, wide for diversity of faith groups. And we invited people at the State Department to come. And amazingly, the whole negotiating team for the US government for the climate came out. And they were visibly moved as we prayed of lament, we prayed of hope. The chief negotiator was taking a video and told us he wanted to share it with his son who goes to religious-based school. And then we gave them a petition really calling for strong action at COP29 with 2,000 some signatures of people of faith. So it's that visible witness. We come together in particular moments and particular spaces and can show this is what we stand for and invite others to join with us.
I love that. And that's really resonating a lot. Our diverse expertise, the relationships that we bring, and that visible witness. It's very powerful things, and definitely something that we want to bring and we bring into our organizing and want to highlight even more, touching into the many things that we're facing today, right? I think we hear about the climate crisis and we're all experiencing differently, right? We know that while it affects us all, no one's safe anywhere around the world from the ecological and climate crisis. There's groups that are disproportionately impacted, right? And this tends to be those that are the most vulnerable in our communities, historically marginalized groups, communities that have become sacrifice zones all over the world and here in the US as well. Women, children, and youth, right, that are facing some of the worst consequences, some of the worst impacts of the climate crisis, and yet they have contributed the least to these emissions, to these greenhouse gas emissions. How do you confront the ecological devastations? Where do you observe it? Where is it palpable? And what are we doing? What are faith communities doing to fight it?
Sure. So I think, a lot of it begins again in relationship. We're hearing people who are most impacted. So for us with the Sisters of Mercy, we were challenged a number of years ago by our sisters in the Philippines and our sisters in Latin America to really focus on some of the root causes of climate change. We hear about the impacts of climate change, but there also is the impact of the extraction of fossil fuels itself. that then contributes to climate change. So our sisters, like I said, in the Philippines and Latin America, who are feeling the effects of climate change and typhoons and flooding and such, calling us to look at this. So I think one of the things in confronting something so vast as ecological devastation is focusing, knowing what is ours to do. So for us as Sisters of Mercy, we said, okay, we're really going to focus on these issues of extractivism, the harms of the actual extraction of natural resources and what they cause to communities and entire peoples. And so that has, really led us into a deep education and advocacy on these issues. And now we're finding more and more faith groups are really interested and concerned about this as well, because they're seeing that interconnection, that with the solutions of climate change also come with negative consequences if we're talking about more mining. So we're seeing more and more faith groups wanting to be part of this. And that again is strengthening our numbers, strengthening what we can do together. So, we can organize webinars together, we can organize statements that we send to Capitol Hill, all kinds of things. And again, it's based in what we're hearing from people that we care about and why this is important. And we can address these issues out of that real sense of relationship. And we're directly responding to people who are facing these issues.
Definitely. And you've mentioned some of the education work that you've done around this. Can you give us an example of some of the communities that you have visited? And then also tell us a little bit more about the work on the extractive interreligious working group and extractive industries.
Sure. So the Sisters of Mercy, we have some practice of having immersion experiences. And a lot of times my colleagues have taken people to the US-Mexico border to understand, the issues of immigration. So we thought about, could we have an immersion experience in extractivism? So we have a sister in New Mexico, and with her help and the help of a Franciscan sister, developed this full, what we called a pilgrimage through the state of New Mexico, looking at New Mexico as a sacrifice zone. So we went to Los Alamos and heard about the history of the testing of atomic weapons and the displacement of indigenous peoples. We went to Navajo Nation in western part of New Mexico and met with indigenous communities that are still feeling, still experiencing the health effects of the uranium mining. And we visited a community center that literally had uranium waste right next to it. And then we went to the Permian Basin, where we saw oil and gas wells everywhere in people's backyards, next to schools, and talking to community organizers. And one of those, we were talking about hope. And one of the community organizers said her hope is that the communities and the people there would understand the health harms that they're facing so that they could make the choice to move. That was so impactful to me, that hope was educating people that they would decide if they needed to move for the health of their families. I'll never forget that. So it's those experiences of educating ourselves, not just reading books, but absolutely being in conversation, seeing devastation, talking to people who are seeing the harms. That moves our heart. And that's what we need to do, is move our heart, not just fill our heads, but move our heart. And that's keeps us motivated, and even when we're in that despair and that discouragement.
Definitely. And as someone who lives in the Permian Basin, definitely appreciate the solidarity, but we also are solidarity with communities all across the states in the world that are suffering from extractive industries, especially those connected with fossil fuels and mining as well. That is so needed for the transition, right? But we are asking for a just transition. We cannot continue to perpetuate justices of the fossil fuel era. And so this is one reason why the principles I think that you all have been working on sound so exciting. Can you tell us more about these principles that your working group has been working on?
Sure. So the main pieces of it really are about how do we make sure that any mining we're doing is done in the most environmentally sustainable and socially just way. So are we having full consultation? There's this whole principle of free, prior, and informed consent, which is making sure people really have all the information, they really have conversation, and that they can then have an informed yes. And if they say no, they don't want mining, that's respected. That has to be part of the process as well. So it's having that transparency, having that consultation. There's pieces about making sure that there's thorough cleanup afterward, that, that we're not leaving devastation behind when a mining company closes up operations, making sure there's transparency in the supply chain. So we know where the minerals are coming from, what conditions they're being mined, and what they're being used for. I mean, we're now seeing that, when we're talking about critical minerals, we all think, well, it's for the energy transition, but it's also for military purposes. A lot of the same minerals are used for, military purposes. And how do we make sure that we're really precise in our language, that we're talking about mining for the energy transition, and that when we're talking about minerals for the military, that doesn't get put into the same bucket and kind of obscures the final uses.
Definitely. And through the work, as I've been following, you are also very careful on noting sourcing and not just mining, right? And this is the reason behind.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That we're source, where are we sourcing them? Which is mining, but it's, it's really being clear that when we're talking about these minerals needed in electric vehicles and, wind turbines, what have you, that they're being sourced somewhere, just like our coffee is sourced somewhere and the fruit we're eating is sourced from, that they're sourced somewhere, and we have to pay attention to the conditions in which, where they're coming from. And so our hope is that, we have this document, and we can use that when we're meeting with members of Congress. We could say, this is what people of faith are thinking about these issues. This is what we're looking for in legislation, that we want to make sure it meets this criteria in the ways that they're designing laws to address these mining concerns.
Definitely. And also looking at the possibility of recycling when possible, right? Looking at being creative also on how we're using those, so that we're thinking systemic solutions, such as public transportation, instead of just increasing the number of electric vehicles, correct? So we're really trying to find systemic.
Yeah, and people talk about a circular economy, and these minerals, they're not like oil and gas that are combusted and gone. These are hard minerals that could be reused. Batteries could be reused. And there's been a lot of research being done, and some environmental groups are really putting a lot of effort in encouraging the federal government to look at this. And then, yes, of course, do we all need individual cars all the time? Can we be have more invested in public transportation, so we reduce the need for lots of cars in the first place.
Definitely. And, you created this wonderful tool, and we just want to share that United Women in Faith are also great, big fans of the work and part of the work of the interreligious group on extractive industries. And so we want to take a moment to share with our members a call to action, and you share a little bit on it, Marianne, but we just also want to highlight, as you said, the importance of sharing with Congress, right? And what is the outcomes of it? What would we hoping that legislators do with this document?
Yeah, so you're hoping that when they're looking at hopefully getting to a point of reforming the 1872 mining law. So if you think about it, the mining law we now are living under was in 1872, when they're using pickaxes, to get gold out of the rock. And now we're, blowing up mountains, we're creating huge pits. There's much large scale industrial, much more harmful processes. So we're looking at, when they're looking at making changes to the law, because we make sure it's going in a more helpful, positive direction, and putting those safeguards in that I named, because there also are pieces of legislation that are making it even easier for mining companies, that are loosening up the little regulations they are and trying to make it easier for mining companies to go in and mine these minerals. So we want to hold up these principles to say what we're for, and also what we're against is loosening the regulations and going in the opposite direction of consultation, environmental processes, and the like.
Thank you so much, Marianne. I would just like to thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. And we hope that your story will inspire others to lead with hope. And when people might feel doubt or maybe feeling overwhelmed, just a nice reminder that we have this wonderful community, sisterhood of faith across interreligious groups working concerned for justice. And so I also want to thank everyone for taking a minute to clicking those links in the chat and filling out that action so that you all contact your legislators. As Marianne said, we want to ask them to align with this principle so that they take it into consideration for future legislation that will be passing. And so this is a beautiful part of being part of the sisterhood of United Women in Faith and working across faith traditions so that we can learn from one another and work together and make a difference for women, children, and youth in our communities locally and also around the world. Thank you again, Marianne.
Yeah, and thank you for letting me be part of your community for this brief while. And all these this icons of love floating around is just wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It is so important to look to examples of how others seem to press on and continue to lead on these issues when things seem overwhelming, whether that be people in scripture or in the world today. It is so difficult to find the energy to lead and influence others in a post-resurrection time. But we are grateful for Ilka and Marianne's example and sisterhood with us here. Now, switch gears for a minute. Take a moment to pull out your timeline and look it over. Notice if any events from today are affected by events you marked down yesterday. Did the evolution of your her story as a woman impact your beliefs in any way? And vice versa, did your beliefs affect the development of your awareness of gender? Much like social issues in today's world, these individual timelines do not exist separately from one another. They intersect and impact one another. I noticed on my own timeline that when one event happens, it affected other events in my life, especially my faith. When my identity as a woman was challenged in some way or limited me from being in a place of leadership. Those times were so overwhelming. And I kind of feel like that now with everything that's going on in the church and the world today.
I agree so much. I kind of feel like that a lot lately in the shadow of the United States general election and even the General Conference in the United Methodist Church. Did you know that female delegates were still underrepresented in many of the conversations on the floor of the General Conference in Charlotte? In fact, the General Commission on the Status and Role of Women monitored the exact breakdown of the delegates. You can find the link to that in the chat. There's so much going on in the world. I'm tired, y'all.
But remember Mary. I bet she was tired too. But she stood up and she spoke out. She took action. And without Mary, there would be no resurrection story.
Certainly not. Well, friends, we've come to the end of our time together, but don't worry. We will be continuing on our timeline journeys, adding one more layer to our life's journey in tomorrow's plenary session at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You won't want to miss it. And in the meantime, we invite you to continue working on your timelines this evening as needed. So go forth from this place with strong faith, knowing with confidence that together as a sisterhood, we can be a voice of hope in this post resurrection world.